Hey, Bill.
Hi,
How
Allison.
you
Thanks for
doing?
having me. If I was doing any better, it'd be a crime.
I took these screenshots literally as I was watching this from my phone. That would be my daughter weighing in, if you can hear her in the background. And so it says, and yes, I do put more credibility in the Wall Street Journal than I do in the New York Post. So this is one of the tapes that Project Veritas put on their YouTube channel. I guess what essentially happened, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, is that he said somebody on the inside of CNN, who he's called a brave insider, gave him access to these meetings. So he could call in and basically recorded multiple meetings and then has released the raw. So you can go check those out. But he's also clipped some that sort of they've been going after for a while now, CNN specifically, but other news organizations in their coverage of Trump and bias against him. And so I think this sort of matches up with, that sort of avenue that they've been on. Now, CNN has said, hey, we refer this to law enforcement and we're not sure if this is legal. James O'Keefe has said, sorry, momming
You're
it
fine.
and doing this. James O'Keefe, who is the founder, has said that he's not heard from anyone. So, and that they have lawyers too and would have done this if it was illegal. But to that specific quote there, where he's talking about having one outlet that he trusts over another. And then, obviously we could talk about the Hunter Biden email story that a lot of people didn't cover. And in fact, journalists who wanted to cover it or ask questions about it were shamed by other journalists. We have another screenshot of that. But as for this one first, what do you think about hearing, like, in your experience, did you have managers that were like, hey, we stack one outlet against another in credibility, so if one organization talks about it, we'll be a little bit more distrustful versus this other one? And then what do you think about how that shapes coverage?
In my experience, if it's a news story that we think it needs to be covered, it needs to be covered. Now, of course, there was, when I was active in the news, there was this great thing called vetting and fact checking and making sure that regardless of the source, you do your homework first. There wasn't a huge rush all the time to be the first out there and the facts be damned.
This was about kind of to that point. This is the Maggie Haberman one, neutrally, if we can pull that up, about how, what are Jake Sherman and Maggie Haberman doing retweeting this? What do you think about that? Like journalists just asking questions saying, hey, let's get a response from the Biden camp about this. And then you have other journalists saying, no, you shouldn't be asking those questions.
People were saying, no, whoa, hold on. You're going to give credit to this story and we're trying to kill it. We don't want it to be and we don't want it to be part of the narrative. We control the narrative. Let's not lend any credence to that. And to say that, to try to censor other journalists or even have the appearance of, we are so shocked and offended that other journalists would lend credence to what seemed to be a viable news story, that's just astonishing to me. I couldn't believe it. I was appalled.
Do you feel like this is a new phenomenon, or did you see this years ago?
No, this is very much a new phenomenon. I've always operated, and everyone that I've ever worked with in this industry, even if they didn't want to, it was the duty, it was your responsibility to make sure that you got both sides of the story. And if you didn't, then you didn't run the story because it had no credence. All you did was slant it to one side because a presentation is everything. If it's okay with you, Allison, there's an interesting question we got here. Do you mind if I respond?
Yeah, no, please do.
Okay, so the Pious Priest, I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Pious.
But Pious, my apologies. Any media bankruptcies we may see in the future? Well, that depends if Nicholas Sandman's attorney gets a hold of anybody else.
I think this one says, let's see here. Just once again, be careful to say that is one that's going to undo him with his voters. That's what it is. Okay. So he's talking about something that Trump said or did. Mm-hmm. And I don't even remember exactly what it was they were discussing specifically, but the reason that I pulled this screenshot and I thought it was interesting is because I found that to be kind of a common theme that like journalists thought they would like pounce on. I mean, even before the election, like when there was I won't say the word, but the grab her scandal. I think there were like, you'd hear people in the newsroom like, okay, this is the end. Like, this is definitely the end. And then there would be like the Russia thing, and then that's the end. And then, you know, like always thinking like this is the end of Trump. And then it's like not the end. And people are still sticking with him and showing kind of the disconnect with the supporters of Trump and the way that some of these news, you know, these journalists, now I want to say just like all the total newsrooms, because I do think there are dissenting opinions in newsrooms that people who had probably voted for Trump and they just don't say it. Because to this point, I think that general kind of tone that not only should there be an end to him, because that's kind of what this is saying, like, like almost like, you know, let's be careful that we're not saying this is the end, but you're almost like hoping, I don't know. I just got that sense. I felt people like, oh, okay, this is it. And I never heard that under the Obama administration. I didn't hear journalists regularly like cheering if something happened negative in the newsroom, or like just, oh my God, you know, the world is ending under this you know, I didn't hear that same kind of emotional reaction.
I completely agree with you. I am not, the names are going to be changed to protect the innocent here. So I have a friend who works at a major network morning show in New York, and she told me recently before the election that media, they kind of had these secret conversations in dark corners that nobody talked about. They really did not want Trump to lose, because Trump is to the media what Obama was to guns. And the media just eats this up. Well, Trump goes out of the spotlight. Trump's no longer the president. What are they going to do now? Because Trump equaled ratings. It really was true.
The video I just did about the MSNBC producer who went on Andrew Yang's podcast and talked about ratings and as it relates to Trump and what they were doing, I think kind of, she discussed that, like, that it was negative controversy that drove the ratings, and just kind of normal intellectual talking about complex topics did not always do that well. And so they just stopped doing that. Does the ultra wealthy deep state play a role here? You know, okay, so Bill, this is another interesting thing to talk about, because I think, like we said before the live stream started, that because journalists don't regularly talk about the problems of the industry, that it's allowed for, I think people have created like ideas about it that are probably more nefarious than what's really going on behind the scenes. But that said, I don't think it's necessarily less dangerous, because I will say sometimes to me, the most dangerous attributes of a bad journalist are not that they're, as C.S. Lewis would call, a robber baron, but they're a moral busybody. One of my favorite quotes of his is that it would be better to live under robber barons than moral busybodies, because the robber baron, at least at some point, you think they're going to have a crisis of conscience, but the moral busybody does, you know, they torment you with with their own soul, basically saying, this is great, we should keep, you know. And so to me, it's like, yeah, like the whole idea of like the deep state and stuff. I mean, the higher you get up on the scale for like network and cable news, there's definitely more money and more power games being played. On a local news level, I would say it's probably like less of that stuff, and more just journalists who don't have time, don't have resources, aren't supported necessarily by management, and then groupthink, like the echo chamber of being in newsrooms that aren't necessarily having relationships with people who are different than them. They all kind of start to think and sound alike, and it just becomes sort of, I don't know, like a machine. What do you think about that?
100% agree with what you said. As far as your local journalists, let's just use like in Des Moines, Iowa, they are not worried about the deep state. They're just worried about trying to make it through the day and trying to cram 12 hours worth of work into an 8-hour day, because heaven forbid you get overtime. Don't even try to get a minute of overtime. So they're not worried about, you know, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, the deeper state topics now, or subjects. I guess you could say at the higher levels of, let's say, a CNN, a Fox News and stuff like that, absolutely, there's some credence to looking into that, or I guess there's enough there to say, hey, maybe somebody should look into it. But for the most part, I would say once you get out of the major metropolitan newsrooms, maybe even most of them as well, they're just trying to get through the day.
That it's a really good point to just kind of clarify for people, because I obviously I do a lot of media critique on this channel, and I do want people to know that there are many, good intentioned and thoughtful people that are still in the industry, but the way that the industry is set up does not necessarily do a service to their abilities to do their job. And so it's kind of like, how do you fix this? I don't know, but I do always say, like, hey, don't necessarily totally give up on mainstream news, but pick up the people that you're interested, like trust the people, don't necessarily trust a brand, or don't even trust anyone, but just find people that you think are trying to do the best. Like, they're being honest with you about being curious to find the truth, and they're giving you different ideas to consider, and they don't always come down on one side of an issue. And then, find other people, but don't necessarily say, I only watch this outlet or I only watch that outlet. I think it used to be like brand recognition. People are like, I trust this brand. Now I'm thinking, hey, you can have good journalists working at a brand that you would not necessarily think like the majority of journalists you like, but that one person may be bringing you great information. So don't totally give up on people that are working in the mainstream world. I think there are a lot of people still in the industry that are trying to do a good job. Like, again, is it the job itself? And then listen, I also have seen journalists, like, in recent times, get nervous, and I don't know what this says about journalists, like if you're nervous to speak the truth or ask hard questions, but now with this sort of like mobocracy that's driving information and people coming after you on Twitter, and even journalists coming after you on Twitter, like we saw with Jake Sherman and Maggie Haberman. Right. It's like, I do find journalists in meetings were hesitant to speak up when they should have in editorial meetings, like these editorial meetings that Project Veritas released. If you heard some of that stuff that I heard on those calls, I mean, I might be nervous to speak up too. Now, I would question whether I should still be in that job if I feel like I can't do it, right? But I do think like that's a fair point, that there may be this tone of the managers, depending on where you're working, where people who have dissenting voices don't feel comfortable talking.
I worked for a lot of different news directors who liked reporters who took ownership of their stories. Somebody who, would say, look, this isn't what is popular, but it's a story that needs to be told, and I'm going to tell it. And that kind of thing was encouraged. Now it is very much pushed down, especially if it's leaning one way to the right. And going back to what you said a little bit, folks, you don't necessarily, we get it. You prefer Ford over Dodge. It doesn't mean you have to choose CNN over Fox News. Go with something that you believe in, something that you trust. Try to find people who will tell you the story, give you the facts, and then make up your mind for yourself.